What's been developing on the Eastern Front over recent months represents a notable shift in how Ukraine is approaching its military operations in the Donetsk region. Rather than focusing purely on frontline engagements, Ukrainian forces have been conducting a sustained campaign targeting Russian rear area infrastructure, and the scope and consistency of that effort is worth examining carefully. To understand why this matters, it helps to start with the geography. Donetsk City functions as the central logistics and coordination hub for Russian forces operating across the Eastern Theater. Supply lines, reinforcement corridors, and command infrastructure all flow through or near this area. That makes it not just a symbolic location, but a genuinely critical node in how Russian forces sustain their operations across multiple axes. Disrupting that hub, even partially, has consequences that extend well beyond the city itself. What makes the current Ukrainian campaign particularly significant is the depth at which it is operating. Strikes have been reported at ranges of roughly 100 to 300 kilometers behind the front line. This is a meaningful development because it challenges the assumption which Russian planners had reasonably relied on that rear area infrastructure beyond a certain distance from the front would be relatively secure. That assumption no longer holds in the same way, and adjusting to that reality requires time, resources, and a reorganization of how supply operations are structured and protected. Across this campaign, Ukraine has reportedly struck around 500 targets. A significant portion of those, approximately 200, have been logistics-related: warehouses, maintenance facilities, fuel storage sites, and ammunition staging areas. These are not glamorous targets, but they are operationally important ones. A modern military force depends on a continuous flow of supplies to maintain its tempo of operations. When the infrastructure that stores and distributes those supplies is repeatedly struck, the effects accumulate over time. Units at the front begin to operate with reduced supplies. Commanders face harder choices about where to direct limited resources. The overall pace of operations slows. 2 Iskander ballistic missile launch sites have also reportedly been destroyed as part of this campaign. These systems represent a significant component of Russia's precision strike capability in the region, able to reach targets well behind Ukrainian lines. Their destruction reduces that capacity directly and also signals that high-value assets previously considered relatively safe are now within reach of Ukrainian strike operations. That has implications for how Russian commanders position and protect their most capable systems going forward. 3 ammunition and fuel depots have also been hit. The operational significance here lies in what these facilities represent, not just the immediate stores destroyed, but the disruption to the supply chain they support. Reconstituting destroyed depot capacity takes time, and during that period, forward units operate with reduced buffers. In a high-intensity conflict where consumption rates are significant, even temporary disruptions to supply can have measurable effects on operational capability. Alongside the strikes on logistics infrastructure, Ukraine has also been targeting Russian air defense assets in the region, specifically Tor and Pantsir systems. The relevance of this to the broader campaign is straightforward. Air defense systems protect other assets from aerial threats. Degrading that protective layer makes it harder for Russia to defend its supply network from further strikes. The 2 efforts, logistics interdiction and air defense suppression, reinforce each other, and conducting them simultaneously reflects a degree of operational coherence. The drone architecture underpinning this campaign is worth describing in some detail because it illustrates how Ukraine has structured its approach across different ranges and mission types. Close to the front line, within roughly 20 kilometers, short-range FPV drones provide persistent surveillance and the ability to engage vehicles and personnel moving along supply corridors. These platforms are relatively inexpensive and can be deployed in large numbers, making it difficult for Russian forces to move supplies in this zone without exposure to risk. Further back, Mid-range strike drones extend Ukrainian reach into the deeper operational rear, targeting road networks and infrastructure nodes that feed into Date City. The combination of these two systems creates overlapping coverage across a significant depth of territory, reducing the safe operating space available to Russian logistics operations. There are no corridors that are clearly free of threat, and that uncertainty itself imposes a cost, slower movement, more cautious routing, increased resource consumption. One characteristic of Ukraine's drone operations that has drawn attention is their reported resilience in a contested electromagnetic environment. Russian forces have invested heavily in electronic warfare capabilities designed to disrupt drone operations, and those systems have had some effect. But Ukrainian platforms have continued to operate effectively in areas where jamming is present, which suggest either technical countermeasures, operational adaptations, or both. The ability to sustain drone operations in a heavily contested environment is a meaningful tactical advantage in this context. Stepping back from the tactical details, the broader strategic logic of this campaign connects to a straightforward principle. Military forces depend on sustainment. Without fuel, ammunition, functioning command infrastructure, and reliable logistics corridors, even a numerically superior force loses its ability to operate effectively. Degrading those systems does not produce immediate visible results in the same way a frontline breakthrough might, but the effects accumulate. Artillery fire rates decline as ammunition becomes harder to move forward. Armored formations slow their tempo as fuel supplies become less consistent. Command coordination becomes less reliable as key nodes are disrupted or relocated. Over time, these compounding pressures reduce the force's capacity to sustain offensive operations at scale. This is particularly relevant given the context of what Russian forces have been building toward in the Donetsk region. There has been a broadly held expectation among analysts that Russia was preparing for a significant push in the summer period, leveraging its quantitative advantages in artillery and manpower. That kind of operation places enormous demands on logistics, high ammunition consumption, constant fuel resupply, frequent unit rotations. A logistics network already under sustained pressure is less capable of supporting those demands, and Ukraine appears to have recognized this and timed its interdiction campaign accordingly. Russia has options for responding to this kind of pressure, and it would be a mistake to assume the campaign will proceed without adaptation. Dispersing supply operations to smaller, lower-profile sites makes targeting harder. Shifting to nighttime movement reduces exposure to some drone types. Establishing alternative supply routes, though more time-consuming and resource-intensive, can partially compensate for disrupted primary corridors. Russian military logistics have shown a capacity for adaptation in previous phases of this conflict, and that capacity should not be discounted. At the same time, adaptation has cost. Dispersal reduces efficiency. Alternative routes are longer and expose convoys to threat for extended periods. Rebuilding destroyed infrastructure requires time and resources. And all of this is happening while Russian forces are also trying to maintain operational pressure on the front line, which itself demands significant logistical support. Balancing those competing demands under sustained interdiction pressure is a genuine operational challenge. The indicators that analysts should watch for as this campaign continues are relatively straightforward to identify, even if their timing is difficult to predict. A visible decline in Russian artillery fire rates in the Donetsk area would suggest that ammunition is becoming harder to move forward consistently. A slowing of offensive tempo on key axes of advance or operational pauses that are not explained by frontline conditions alone could reflect logistics pressure rather than tactical decisions. Changes in how Russian forces structure their supply operations, greater dispersion, more frequent use of smaller convoys, shifts in timing and routing would indicate adaptation to sustained interdiction pressure, which itself confirms that the pressure is being felt. None of these indicators would constitute definitive proof that the campaign has achieved its objectives. Military logistics systems are resilient and capable of absorbing significant punishment before they reach a point of failure. But the accumulation of these signals over time would provide a reasonable basis for assessing whether Ukraine's interdiction effort is translating into measurable operational effects at the front. It is also worth noting what this campaign does not represent. It is not a guaranteed path to a rapid or decisive shift in the overall military situation. Wars of this kind fought at this scale, with the resources and strategic investments that both sides have committed, do not typically turn on single campaigns or operational developments. The front line in the Donetsk region has been shaped by months of attritional fighting, and the factors that will ultimately determine its trajectory include many variables beyond logistics, manpower, equipment availability, political will, international support, and the decisions made by commanders on both sides in response to evolving conditions. What the campaign does represent is a serious and operationally coherent effort to shift one of those variables. The sustainability of Russian offensive operations in this theater in Ukraine's favor, whether it succeeds in doing so at a meaningful scale, will depend on Ukraine's ability to sustain the intensity and sophistication of the effort over time, which is itself not guaranteed. Drone operations at this scale require a continuous supply of platforms and components, trained operators, functioning targeting and intelligence systems, and protection of the infrastructure that supports all of the above. Russian countermeasures, improved electronic warfare, expanded air defense coverage, efforts to locate and strike Ukrainian drone operators and launch sites will continue to evolve, and Ukraine will need to adapt. In turn, the broader context in which this campaign is unfolding is also relevant. Ukraine has been operating under significant resource constraints throughout this conflict, and those constraints have periodically affected its ability to sustain high-tempo operations. The degree to which international support, particularly in terms of drone components, targeting systems, and broader military assistance, continues to flow, will have a direct bearing on how long and how effectively this interdiction campaign can be maintained. That is a factor outside Ukraine's direct control, and it introduces uncertainty into any assessment of how the campaign develops from here. From a wider analytical perspective, what is unfolding around Donetsk also contributes to a growing body of operational experience about how drone technology is changing the character of conventional warfare. The ability to hold an adversary's rear area infrastructure at persistent risk, not just with occasional long-range strikes, but with a continuous layered system of surveillance and engagement, represents a meaningful evolution in how smaller or less conventionally powerful forces can generate operational effects against larger ones. The experience being accumulated in this conflict by both sides is being studied carefully by military establishments around the world, and it is already influencing thinking about force structure, logistics design, and the role of electronic warfare in future conflicts. For Russia specifically, the challenge posed by Ukraine's drone campaign reflects a broader tension in how the Russian military has structured and sustained its operations in this war. The quantitative advantages that Russia brought into the conflict in artillery, armored vehicles, aircraft, and personnel remain real, but they are advantages that depend on functioning logistics to be operationally useful. A tank without fuel does not confer an advantage. An artillery piece without ammunition does not provide fire support. A numerical superiority in manpower that cannot be reliably rotated, supplied, and supported does not translate cleanly into battlefield outcomes. Ukraine's approach of targeting the systems that make Russian quantitative advantages functional rather than attempting to match those advantages directly reflects a strategic logic that has shown results in earlier phases of this conflict and appears to be applied with greater sophistication in the current campaign. What remains genuinely uncertain is the timeline and magnitude of the effects. Logistics interdiction campaigns historically take time to produce visible operational results. The systems being targeted are large, partially redundant, and supported by an industrial and organizational base that has shown a capacity to absorb losses and continue functioning. Russia's ability to reconstitute destroyed facilities, establish alternative supply arrangements, and adapt its operational patterns means that the effects of this campaign will likely be gradual rather than sudden. The question is whether Ukraine can sustain the pressure long enough and at sufficient intensity for those gradual effects to accumulate to a level that meaningfully constrains Russian operational capability in the region. That is the central question that the coming weeks and months will begin to answer. The indicators described earlier, changes in artillery rates, offensive tempo, and logistics patterns, will provide some visibility into how that question is resolving. But a complete picture will take time to emerge, and assessments made on the basis of incomplete information during an active and fast-moving conflict should be held with appropriate caution. What can be said with reasonable confidence is that Ukraine has constructed and is executing a campaign that is operationally serious, that it is targeting systems whose degradation would have real consequences for Russian military capability in the Donetsk theater, and that it is doing so with a degree of coherence and persistence that reflects genuine strategic planning rather than opportunistic strikes. Whether that is sufficient to produce the operational outcomes Ukraine is working toward remains to be seen. But the effort itself represents a meaningful development in how this conflict is being fought, and its progress warrants careful and sustained attention from anyone seeking to understand where the war in eastern Ukraine is heading.